Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon for our 2025 Bernard D. Nossiter Class of 1947 lecture as part of our 100-day speaker series. My name is Eli Moyes. I'm a 27 studying government and creative writing, and on campus, I'm the debate director of the Dartmouth Political Union and an opinion editor at the Dartmouth. Established by the Nossiter family in 1994 in honor of Bernard D. Nossiter, 47, and his contributions to journalism, the annual Nossiter Lecture brings a Harvard University Nieman Fellow to campus to discuss their area of journalism and to talk about their experience in journalism. This year, we are doubly lucky because our Nieman Fellow and Nossiter lecturer, David M. Herszenhorn, is also a 1994 graduate of Dartmouth College and former editor-in-chief of the Dartmouth, the daily student newspaper. This is especially meaningful because Bernard Nossiter also acted as co-editor of the Dartmouth Log, a wartime version of the Dartmouth. Like Bernard Nossiter, David Herszenhorn also worked for the Washington Post. From 2022 to 2024, he served as the Post's Russia, Ukraine, and East Europe editor, overseeing coverage of the war in Ukraine and wartime Russia, and was just named European Affairs editor for the Post, where he will lead coverage across Europe in a time of unique economic, political, and global challenges. Herszenhorn previously worked as the chief Brussels correspondent and associate editor at Politico Europe, and for the New York Times as Moscow-based international correspondent, congressional correspondent, and Metro reporter. He's also the author of The Dissident, Alexei Navalny, Profile of a Political Prisoner. We'll hear from David Herszenhorn in just a bit, followed by a moderated conversation with Professor William Woolforth, Daniel Webster Professor in the Government Department. After the moderated conversation, there will be opportunity for audience Q&A. For those joining us in person, when we reach the audience Q&A portion of our program, you can raise your hand and one of our student assistants will bring you a microphone. Please be sure to wait for the microphone before speaking to make sure that everyone in the room and on our live stream can hear you. As a reminder, Dartmouth is committed to protecting free expression and peaceful dissent, an open exchange of ideas, and a culture of mutual respect. We ask that you do not interfere or disrupt today's program, which would include preventing attendees from seeing or hearing our guest and moderator, or interfering with our guests and moderator's ability to speak or be heard. Please join me in welcoming David Herszenhorn to the stage.
So much. Thank you, Eli, for that kind introduction, and thank you to the Rockefeller Center and to the Nossiter family for the invitation to speak to you today. It's always such a pleasure to be here at Dartmouth, to be home. Bernard D. Nossiter, class of 47, was a legend in American journalism. I also worked with one of his sons, Adam Nossiter, at the New York Times, where I spent most of my professional life, and it really is a tremendous honor to give this lecture. The title of this talk, From Dartmouth to Donbas, Stories from the Front Lines in the Global Fight for Democracy and Decency. It'll jump around a little bit. As you heard, my career did that as well. Since leaving Dartmouth in 1994, my work as a journalist has taken me from New York City, where I was born and raised, to Washington, D.C., Moscow, Kiev, to Crimea and the battlefields in eastern Ukraine, to Brussels, where there were clashes with the UK over Brexit, with Poland and Hungary over the rule of law, and with Donald Trump during his first term, the turbulent term of threats against allies, ill-conceived trade wars, and general mayhem and disruption. And then back to Ukraine at the start of Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. Based on all of these experiences, and on the academic year, this academic year of reflection as a Nieman Fellow in journalism at Harvard, I'm here to tell you that we are very much in a fight for the future of democracy and for basic human decency. It's not a pretty picture. And yet, I'm also here to tell you, at least those of you who are students, that there's no better place than Dartmouth to prepare you for the mess out there. I'm also here to tell you, if it's any consolation, that this fight is not entirely new. In fact, in many cases, what we're confronting is sinister revanchism, efforts to turn back the clock, to redraw agreed-upon borders, to reverse past progress, to avenge previous defeats. Vladimir Putin's brutal war in Ukraine, for instance, is not and has never been about Ukraine. but rather about his obsession with reversing, to the extent possible, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and what he views as Russia's subjugation and humiliation by the West, as the loser of the Cold War. He envisions a new Slavic power rising from the defeated nation that traded the ideological bankruptcy of communism for the craven kleptocracy of a pseudo-capitalist extraction economy. I'll come back to Russia and Ukraine, but for the sake of immediacy and relevance, let's start here at Dartmouth. First, a disclaimer. As a journalist, I've long aspired to objectivity. I've never been registered, for instance, in any political party. But as it has become clear that we live in a post-factual era in which people not only claim their own proprietary opinions, but also their own alternative facts, objectivity has lost some of its luster. On certain topics, journalists cannot be objective. If the question is truth or lies, we're on the side of truth. If the debate is between democracy or totalitarianism, we stand with democracy. Feigned objectivity, without taking account of core values of right and wrong, leads to a trap of false equivalence. At moments when objectivity presents such a trap, a standard of truth-telling and of fairness must take its place. So while I might sound like I have a viewpoint, it is because I aspire to tell you the truth, based on facts, as I've discerned them through fair-minded reporting and first-hand observation. Speaking of observation, perhaps you've noticed that there are powerful people in this country who have a lot to say these days about anti-Semitism on college campuses. Make no mistake, they're gaslighting us. The crusade against America's institutions of higher learning is not about fighting anti-Semitism or protecting Jewish students. To be sure, we've seen anti-Semitism in the Ivy League, including at Dartmouth. Shortly after I arrived in Hanover as a first-year student in September 1990, the Dartmouth Review published an anti-Semitic excerpt from Hitler's Mein Kampf. The quote appeared in the newspaper's masthead just before the start of Yom Kippur, the holiest Jewish holiday. I believe today that I am acting in the sense of the Almighty Creator, it said. By warding off the Jews, I am fighting for the Lord's work. The review claimed it was a victim of an act of sabotage, but few were gullible enough to believe that. The quote from Mein Kampf was merely the continuation of a years-long campaign of nastiness, cloaked in conservatism, in which students working on the review attacked women, Jews, African Americans, the LGBTQ community, Native Americans, Muslims, and others, in pursuit of a vision of America and of Dartmouth that favored white Christian men, that placed patriarchal, even colonialist traditions over basic decency and respect for fellow human beings and community. At times, this nastiness was excused as sophomoric satire. Those who responded with outrage were told that they didn't know how to take a joke. None of it was funny. James O. Friedman, who was president of the college when I was a student here, spoke out against the review with moral clarity and with confidence in his conviction that a liberal education was the best antidote to bigotry. What the review has done on this campus has not been decent, Friedman said at a faculty meeting. What it has done has been irresponsible, mean-spirited, cruel, and ugly. Of course, the review mocked Friedman by adding mean-spirited, cruel, and ugly to its masthead, the same masthead that would later carry the Hitler quote, describing them as the in-house council. But one needs only go back and read William F. Buckley Jr.'s 1992 essay, In Search of Anti-Semitism, to understand that certain right-wing advocates in the United States for decades have sought to conflate fair criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, and then mounted a fall crusade against this so-called anti-Semitism in a bid to win over conservative Jewish supporters and to divide the left. The Trump administration's feigned crusade against anti-Semitism on American college campuses is a revival of this tactic. And the same people lying to us about anti-Semitism are proposing policies in the Middle East, such as the forced displacement of 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, that would risk further humanitarian catastrophe and make the world more dangerous. President Friedman, by contrast, forced a genuine reckoning of anti-Semitism at Dartmouth and throughout the Ivy League with his landmark speech in 1998 at the dedication of the Roth Center. For Friedman, the goal was to openly acknowledge and thereby exercise historic wrongs. For President Trump, the goal seems to be to exact revenge against educated communities that overwhelmingly support his political opponents. For some of Trump's more cunning allies, enablers, and propagandists, however, it's about winding back the clock, an attempt to reopen battles that they had clearly lost, as Americans recognized and embraced policies of non-discrimination, such as marriage equality. Progress inevitably faces backlash. But well before the current assault on institutions of higher learning, Trump succeeded in reviving a politics of nastiness that had fallen out of favor, though certainly never vanished, since the Willie Horton days of George H.W. Bush. For what now seems like a blink of 16 years, we witnessed the compassionate conservatism of George W. Bush and Obama's hope for change. Once upon a time, Mr. Rogers may have been the most watched Dartmouth personality on American television. Now, with sincere apologies to Stephen Colbert and my friend Jake Tapper, that distinction belongs to Laura Ingraham, who of course got her start on the Dartmouth Review. Nastiness, whether fear-mongering about immigrants, vaccine skepticism, or denigrating minority athletes, apparently makes for good TV. 6 months after the Mein Kampf incident, at the start of April during my freshman year, my editor on the D called me at my dorm in Woodward Hall. "We have an assignment for you," the editor, Matt Mosk, said. "We want you to go undercover and rush SAE." Sigma Alpha Epsilon, facing a cash crunch, was rumored to be planning a challenge to the college's ban on rushing freshmen in a bid for new members and dues. But when asked about this by other fraternities, members of SAE denied it, which prompted my editor's plan to seek firsthand confirmation. The story caused a bit of a stir, and you can guess did wonders for my social life. Among the many reactions to that coverage, the Review included me in their weekly conventional wisdom chart with a thumbs down. "The newest addition to the great line of Daily D reporters," it proclaimed. "What rock did this slug crawl out from under?" This was slightly more eloquent than the puddle of vomit left at my dorm room door, along with a note that said, "Here's to you from SAE." But the reaction that followed my reporting on SAE was good preparation. Newspaper readers can get emotional. Years later, when I was covering the development of the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, in Congress, one reader of the New York Times sent me an email that closed by saying, "I hope you get rectal cancer and die, and it leaves your family bankrupt." Whatever I had written, I can assure you it did not rise to the level of capital punishment or family insolvency. But the lesson I took with me from Dartmouth was not just that people can be gratuitously nasty, but that like President Friedman, we can and should stand up to the nastiness, speaking out firmly for our community values, for decency. "Ideas matter," Friedman often said. "People matter." Given Dartmouth's history of standing up for decency and values, it was more than a bit disturbing to watch last year as 2 journalists for the D were arrested on the Green as they covered their fellow students and professors engaging in constitutionally protected free speech. And even more disturbing that the initial reaction from the college was a bland statement acknowledging that the reporters believed that they were arrested in error. The statement added, "We stand by their right to vindicate that belief through the legal process." Wow, how courageous, so principled. It should not have taken 4 days for the leadership of the college to declare unequivocally that journalists, clearly identified as such, should never be arrested for doing their jobs. Nor, for that matter, should students and professors be arrested for exercising their rights to free speech and peaceable assembly. It was even harder to believe that the scene last year occurred here on the Green, in Hanover. I've experienced similar situations while covering the white ribbon protests in Moscow in 2011 and 2012, for example, where Putin's helmeted riot police, the Oman, often seemed to take special pleasure in targeting journalists wearing press credentials as they indiscriminately seized people and forced them into police vans. Or during Ukraine's Maidan Revolution in 2013 in Kyiv, where Viktor Yanukovych's Berkut stormtroopers sought to viciously disperse young people who were demonstrating in favor of democracy after their president backed away from his promise, his campaign promise, to sign political and economic agreements with the European Union. More than a decade later, Ukraine's fight for democracy and for survival continues. But I digress. Bernard D. Nossiter, class of 47, was not just a brilliant journalist. He was also a trained economist, which is an extremely useful credential in covering politics and policy. Everyone is entitled to their own political opinions, but some political opinions, from an economic or mathematical perspective, are extremely difficult, if not impossible, to defend. And if we're not clear-eyed about the math, the public will be misled and misinformed. In a participatory democracy, that means public policy will be misguided. When I was covering the healthcare debate in Congress, I wrote a piece in the Times in which I interviewed William Baumol, the noted economist whose groundbreaking work on wages and labor productivity helps explain why the costs of healthcare and other services, including education, the arts, and law enforcement, always rise faster than inflation. Or as Baumol put it in the title of a book that he published 2 years later, Why Computers Get Cheaper and Healthcare Doesn't. The same work explains why college tuition will always rise faster than inflation. Baumol, who died in 2017, was a big supporter of the Affordable Care Act. But in the interview that I did with him, he also cautioned President Obama and congressional Democrats not to overpromise in terms of what their healthcare initiative could ever achieve in controlling healthcare costs. Baumol's work also explains why the rising cost of healthcare and other essential government services in and of itself is not evidence of mismanagement or inefficiency, a common accusation by those seeking to cut those essential government services. No one has found the way to prevent healthcare costs from growing, so the bottom line is they will grow, Baumol told me. That means that the less efficient of our population are going to need help in being provided with adequate medical care. But Baumol offset his warnings with reassuring optimism. While labor-intensive sectors don't experience productivity efficiency that can drive down costs, much of the highly diversified entrepreneurial American economy does experience such efficiency. And that makes us a wealthy country that can afford services for those who need them, at home and even abroad. We can afford it, Baumol said, because we're an economy in which innovation and productivity all continue to rise and provide us the means with which we can afford to provide health care to the people to whom it is denied today. A last point on health care. The same people who have a lot to say these days about anti-Semitism on college campuses also have quite a bit to say about government spending, including Social Security and Medicare. In 2003, the single largest unfunded government expenditure in modern history, the prescription drug benefit in Medicare, known as Medicare Part D, was approved by a Republican House and a Republican Senate and signed into law by a Republican president. Now, some folks might say, well, this proves Republicans are hypocrites on government spending. So were the Democrats more fiscally responsible? No, of course not. The Democrats wanted the program to be bigger and more generous. And yet, is there really any debate that retirees should have access to the medication that they need? The more pertinent question is, do other developed Western democracies somehow manage to give their citizens top-notch medical care, including prescription drugs, without limiting their choice of doctors and other providers, while also spending less and achieving a longer life expectancy? Living in Belgium, as I have for nearly the last decade, I can tell you the answer is yes. According to the Peterson KFF Health System Tracker, life expectancy in Belgium is 82.5 years. 4 years longer than the 78.4 years in the United States, while per capita health spending is 45% lower, just under $7,400 per person per year, compared to more than $13,400 in the US. Keep in mind, Belgium is not a country known for its blue zone Mediterranean diet, but for beer, French fries, chocolate, and waffles. By moving to Belgium, I obviously avoided healthcare bankruptcy once wished upon me by a New York Times reader. Another example of emotionally driven political opinion colliding with economic reality was Brexit, the UK's departure from the European Union, which I covered in Brussels for Politico Europe. I arrived in Brussels 2 months after the referendum in which British voters narrowly chose to leave. At the time, I was not super expert in EU politics. Being from New York City, I would often tell people that I went to Europe with a Queen's accent, but it was the wrong Queen. What I heard, of course, was a lot of loud rhetoric from the Leave campaign about how the Brits were slaves to the Brussels bureaucrats. What I saw in Brussels, though, was precisely the opposite. The British were perched in a place of privilege between the Germans, who hold all the money and the power in continental Europe, and the French, who do all the talking. More often than not, it was the Brits making the decisions. And all of the institutions, like the European Court of Justice, were modeled after the British system. The conclusion, to my eyes, was a simple one. The Brits could be leaders of a bloc of 330 million people, or a small island nation with bad weather and bad food. The referendum campaign was marred, of course, by rampant disinformation. A group of academics once sent an open letter warning of this. A referendum result is democratically legitimate only if voters can make an informed decision, they wrote. Yet the level of misinformation in the current campaign is so great that democratic legitimacy is called into question. Both sides are making misleading claims. Another argument in favor of journalists. By virtually every unbiased economic analysis, Britain would be worse off as a result of Brexit. And 9 years later, those predictions have proven true. I suspect that for Bernard Nossiter, who wrote a book in 1978 called Britain, A Future That Works, he would have been deeply dismayed. A key lesson, especially relevant amid the current US administration's erratic tariff policies, is that while people lie, the numbers don't. Tariffs, by definition, raise the cost of doing business, which drives prices up, not down. And financial markets respond accordingly. So, I promise to come back to Russia-Ukraine, where the threat to the rules-based order and to democratic freedom is most vividly on display. So let's do that. There's quite a lot of misinformation and many common misperceptions, and I'd like to clear up a few. First, the war did not start in 2022. It started in 2014 when Russia invaded and seized Crimea. I was there. I watched soldiers in uniforms without insignia remove the Russian license plates from their military vehicles. I took before and after pictures with my phone. Second, Ukraine did not start this war. Putin's military aggression in 2014 was a response to Ukrainians taking to the streets on Maidan, demanding a free, democratic future in the European Union, just as their president had promised. Putin, however, cannot risk Ukraine becoming a well-functioning, prosperous, free, democratic country. It would spell the end of his corrupt, kleptocratic, oligarchic regime. Third, this is not about NATO. Non-alignment was actually enshrined in the Ukrainian constitution, and Putin invaded anyway. Ukraine adopted its official policy to pursue NATO membership in response to Russia's military aggression. Fourth, this war, as I mentioned at the start, is not really about Ukraine at all. Trump thinks he's negotiating a conflict over 5 regions in southeast Ukraine, and his negotiators, largely ignorant of the region and its history, are trying to achieve a short-term peace deal. Putin is relitigating the Cold War, and he's going for a win with a capital W. He believes, rightly or wrongly, that the West, led by Washington, has never negotiated with Russia in good faith, so he's fully prepared to violate any agreement he makes because he expects the US will not keep its word. Fifth, in case it's not clear, Putin, in pursuit of this larger vengeance against America, intends to conquer and own Ukraine, or he will destroy Ukraine. The agreement that Trump today is pressuring Zelensky to accept is not a deal for Ukraine. It's defeat for Ukraine. In the months before I went on leave from the Washington Post for the Nieman Fellowship, much of my focus was on a series of articles called Russia Remastered, about how Putin has been using the war to accelerate sweeping changes in his own country, where he's been building a highly militarized society conditioned for long-term conflict with the US and the West as enemies. In many ways, what's even more alarming is how so much of the Putin playbook now seems to apply in the United States. One article in that series focused on the Kremlin's total takeover of Russia's higher education system, purging liberals and installing patriotic administrators who have eliminated virtually all academic partnerships with the West and are reshaping course offerings to align with Putin's nationalist agenda. Another article focused on how Putin is crushing Russian culture, forcing out directors of premier artistic institutions, including the Bolshoi Theater and the Tretyakov Gallery, in favor of political appointees willing to shape performances and exhibitions to align with the war agenda and patriotic rhetoric. Yet another story focused on the treatment of women who are being pushed into retrograde tradwife roles and urged to give birth early and often, to support the fatherland and replenish the ranks of the military. But while Russia provides ample cause for alarm, including its tightened alliances with China, North Korea, and Iran, I want to share a couple of thoughts about why Washington and its Western European allies need to engage in some serious introspection. There's been a notable shift recently in White House press operations, with access reduced for reputable news organizations and an increasing amount of time being given over to so-called journalists from new outlets, sycophants who ask absurd questions that do not reflect any inquisitiveness or sense of responsibility to hold power to account, but rather show blind support for Trump administration policies. This is an even bigger shame because there was actually a very serious need for reform in how the White House interacts with journalists. In Geneva, at a summit between Putin and Joe Biden in the spring of 2021, the Russian president held a news conference where he fielded questions from a wide array of news organizations, not just Russian state-controlled propagandists, though there was no shortage of them, but also Bloomberg, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the BBC, and on and on. Biden, by contrast, gave a news conference where Jen Psaki called on a predetermined list of reporters from the traveling White House press corps, all of them from American organizations. Not a single Russian journalist was given a question, though the administration, of course, could have chosen and picked anyone. Meanwhile, non-American outlets in the White House press corps, including The Guardian and the Financial Times, who last time I checked publish in English, were treated as foreign journalists, as was I working for Politico Europe because I was based in Brussels. To a casual observer, which leader would seem more democratic, more open to public scrutiny, more willing to be challenged? Just as global trade policy was in tatters, for example, with the dispute resolution mechanism of the WTO paralyzed and in need of desperate reform, White House press operations were in sore need of an overhaul. Not to provide less accountability for the democratically elected American president, but more. Not for the questions to get easier, but to be tougher, to be more interesting, to be more diverse. Even more disturbing, after the discovery of atrocities committed by the Russian military in Bucha, Irpin, and other communities just north of Kiev, I wrote a piece about how senior United States and European officials had made clear that they had no intention of intervening directly to save civilian lives. Putting a stop to war crimes is not in the interest of the United States, at least not if it means going to war with Russia, according to White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, is how the article began. Preventing atrocities like the murder of civilians in Ukraine is not in the interest of the EU, at least not if it means higher gas prices or colder homes in winter, according to Austrian Finance Minister Magnus Brunner. The evidence of brutal killings and torture by Russian forces in Bucha, a town on the outskirts of Kiev, has drawn gasping proclamations of outrage and dismay at the highest levels of government in the world's most powerful nations, from Chancellor Olaf Scholz in Berlin to President Emmanuel Macron in Paris to Prime Minister Boris Johnson in London and across the ocean to President Joe Biden in Washington. The story continued. But as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky discovered when he addressed the United Nations Security Council on Tuesday, none of these powerful people have any intention of doing anything to intercede directly in hopes of halting Russian soldiers' crimes of aggression in Ukraine. Under repeated questioning about whether there was anything Biden, perhaps the only leader on earth who could muster an international coalition to intervene militarily in Ukraine, could or would do to immediately stop Russia's war crimes, Jen Psaki's answer was, quote, "The president's objective is, and his responsibility is, to make decisions that are in the interest of the United States and the national security of the United States and the American people. And that is not to go to war with Russia." Given what's going on in the world, and here in America, I sense we're increasingly faced with a very uncomfortable question. Not only what kind of lives we want to have, but what principles are we willing to die for? Thank you very much.
That was wonderful. I think we are now to sit here and get the conversation going.
Thank you.
Well, what a wonderful lecture that was. I should say, not a lecture, but what wonderful and appropriate remarks, weaving together all of these themes, especially woven through them the role of journalists in a free society. I don't have the ability to ask questions that will necessarily draw all of those themes together. But I want to try to be at least a little provocative, a little contrary, which is hard to do with such an eloquent speech that reflects values that almost everybody I know would subscribe to wholeheartedly. But one of them would be this. Polls show, polls indicate that two of the institutions that were interwoven through your remarks, the mainstream, as it is called, or the most distinguished journalistic establishments, the media, and higher education, are overwhelmingly democratic. They are sometimes to the point of 9-1, sometimes more than 9-1. We taught a class in the fall of this term here at Dartmouth on the 2024 election and had an anonymous poll of the students in that class, and I believe 7 or 8 indicated that they might be intending to vote Republican in the presidential election. So I guess the question is, setting aside and not in any way trying to, in any sense, defend the attacks against these two institutions that are emanating from the White House today, do you think that's a problem?
It's a tremendous problem. First and foremost, it should be, and I think it was a tremendous problem in the eyes of what I would regard as true conservatives, who were willing and able to build their arguments on facts, on knowledge, on knowable, provable truth. And so it's troubling because there are, look, make no mistake about it, there are quite a lot of people who will not read the newspaper I work for because Washington is in the name. They won't read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal because New York and Wall Street are in the names. You know, I don't know, does USA Today fare better? Maybe a little bit, just on that. And of course, we know more people will get their news from TV and maybe now from TikTok and Facebook. There is a crisis. There's a crisis of trust. There is a crisis in education. But is that the fault of educational institutions that in certain quarters of the country there isn't quite the market? It's a real question. Ultimately, in the United States, and I sort of alluded to this, the public drives public policy. And of course, that's what we're seeing, right? The voters got what they voted for. They elected Donald Trump. I had an editor who liked to say, the readers eventually figure out what we know. It just takes them longer, right? So I think part of what we're seeing right now is an education happening for American voters in what we would call red states. I'm not sure that I love that, camp color war dichotomy, but that's the system we have, right? The parliamentary systems in Europe are a lot more interesting in some ways because it allows for, you'd have the Lynn Cheney Republicans and then the Matt Gaetz Republicans, right? And the Trump MAGA crowd. You'd be able to differentiate, which we can't do, right? And this is a problem in Congress. It's a reason why Congress struggles now so hard to legislate at all, and the European Parliament, which is just as much a circus as Congress can be, still can do business to some degree. But there are really tough questions to ask about why that's so.
A second question. I'm only going to ask 3, so folks, get ready with your own. That's the main job here. I'm just here to get things going. But a second question is whether you think that, well, let me back up. Journalists like yourself, and here highlighting your reporting on Alexei Navalny and on the noble, beleaguered liberal opposition inside Russia, journalists have done a great job of, if people will just read what they write, of conveying where those people are coming from, who dislike the Putin regime and who take great risks to their own personal safety to oppose it. But do you think an average standard reader of the Washington Post, the New York Times, has a fulsome enough understanding of the worldview of the people who actually are running Russia? I mean, it's not a question you explain, not defend, but do you think an average reader, is there reporting that conveys, like, what are these people thinking?
I wish I could send all the readers to your class. I do. And you know, some of us we try, but the short answer is no, right? The short answer is no. That and this is sometimes the fault of journalism, and sometimes the fault of short attention spans. You know, if you get me started, I can be very critical of political reporting, especially horse race stuff. Polling drives me nuts, right? It's such a waste of time and money on this horse race when the only poll that matters, you know, is at the end of one Tuesday night. And you know, and there are people who say, actually, we had somebody at the AP who was really expert on this, talking to the Neiman Fellows off the record, and somebody trying to like rescue the moment for polls was like, but the polls of polls are better, right? And he was like, no, they're not. It's like garbage in, garbage out. And so, but you're right. Folks don't understand, and why is that? And now here, I'm going to say a few tough things about some of the beloved places where I've worked, but. It's very easy, and editors are very receptive at mainstream American news organizations. If, as a Russia correspondent, you want to write 3 stories a week about Vladimir Putin with his shirt off wrestling with tigers, that fits a stereotype that, you know, there's an action hero figure there. When you start to write that, you know, Vladimir Putin is, you know, a bad guy on many levels, but when he says that much, if not all, of what the U.S. has touched in the Middle East has gone to hell, that also happens to be true. Now, Putin is in fact was underestimated even by Navalny, who considered himself Putin's greatest nemesis, right? Navalny did not understand that when he was going back after recovering from the poisoning assassination attempt in Germany, he did not realize, I don't believe he understood that Putin was actually ready to invade and destroy a country of 40 million people. If Navalny could have understood that, I'm not sure he would have he maybe still would have, because he had in his head that he still, you know, the only way to salvage his political career would be to go back and not stay out. But he way underestimated Putin, and I think Trump and his team are doing that right now. They have no idea how committed Putin is to his objectives, how little regard he has for American leadership. You know, he's outlasted them all. You know, look at the photos over the years. You know, he laughs at it. You have elections to worry about, haha. And whatever deal might or might not happen right now, he will be back to accomplish his full goals, which are to subjugate Ukraine and restore some, you know, alliance between Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, this kind of Nova Russia that he talks about. And if it's not now, it'll be in 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. And there are folks in Ukraine who understand this very well. There are folks in Poland. You know, the closer you live to Russia, the better you understand it. But, you know, we are blessed to be between these two oceans, and it is far away. And for a lot of people, including the vice president, it feels like, oh, you know, what the hell does this matter to any of us? And in fact, you know, it does matter, just as it mattered in World War II, that democracy can't be taken for granted, that freedom isn't free, and it's under threat. You know, if an alliance between Russia and China is not enough to wake people up. I mean, I had a colleague who not only wants to live in Washington, but can't imagine living anywhere other than on Capitol Hill, like in the shadow of the Capitol building of the United States. And when I told him that I was leaving Washington and was going to go to Russia, he was silent for maybe 4 days. And finally he said, well, I guess it's okay, because in the end, it's going to be us and them against China, because they'll never be on China's side. It might be the only thing he was ever wrong about. Somebody I really admire. But China and Russia are now, as you see, in this alliance, despite that giant border. And as climate change continues, we know where, you know, 1 billion plus thirsty, hot Chinese may go. It's not south.
Last question, and then it's going to be audience. And as a forewarning, when I turn to the audience, I'm going to lean heavily and call first upon students. But the last question. Can you see a way of ending the Ukraine war, the Russia's war against Ukraine, that is in any way consistent with the principles you articulated, that has Vladimir Putin still in power?
That has Vladimir Putin still in power.
End of the Ukraine war consistent with the principles you articulated, with Vladimir Putin still in power?
Yes.
Ah.
But not, is it realistic? No.
Oh, okay.
I mean, did we miss our moment? Did the U.S. miss its moment? Probably. So I would say, talk about missed moments, right? If And the Biden administration was so proud of itself that it began predicting in late 2021 that he's going to invade, he's going to invade, he's going to invade. And then, he invaded. Like, see, he invaded, but what did you do about it? And if they had formed some sort of coalition and stood on the line of contact as it existed then in Donbas with some Japanese, the Baltics surely would have been in, Poland, it didn't have to be a NATO operation necessarily, but a coalition of the willing, and said, are you going to shoot all of us? Would he have come across the line? I doubt it. There was effectively a green light. I mean, there are rumors to this effect that the former head of the CIA basically told him so, and we know that they expected this war to be over and done in 3 days. There are other scenarios, and this is maybe why journalists shouldn't make policy, where, again, a coalition of the willing could accept an invitation by President Zelensky to help expel foreign invaders from his territory. And if we've seen Russia's military has not performed all that well in this war against a country that has virtually no air force. What the Pentagon has asked the Ukrainians to do are things, the military, are things that no American commander would ever agree to. The kinds of operations they've suggested without air support is just preposterous. If you look at how the U.S. fought its wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which arguably were less consequential than this one for the future security of the United States, right? I mean, and I deal with this all the time. A lot of people trying to compare the Middle East and Russia-Ukraine. So how many ICBMs that can reach U.S. soil does Hamas have, right? How many does Iran have? And how many does Russia have? 346, right? The stakes for America are much higher in Ukraine. And if Biden perhaps had been braver, you heard the words of Jen Psaki, like they viewed it as, stay out of this war. But we have this real question about whether if the fear that Putin is going to go nuclear and the prospect of him dropping a nuclear bomb on Ukraine next door to his own country strikes me as highly unrealistic, right? He's afraid of COVID and other germs, sits at that long table. But if that fear is going to prevent the United States from taking a leadership position in, standing up to military aggression, then what? Then everybody knows now, get yourself some nukes and the United States will do nothing. So again, the moment may have passed, but there are scenarios whereby, if Putin is assured that as long as his troops are on the Russian side of the line, and everybody knows where the borders were drawn in 1991, Russia agreed to them as well, that the sovereignty of his state is assured, then why not? Zelensky under international law has every right to request help in clearing his territory. That would require an air war at least and other stuff that would put American lives and NATO lives at risk. I don't think that any president was willing to undertake that, certainly not this one.
Awesome. All right, we are open for questions. Do you need yeah, I think you need a mic.
And please introduce yourselves.
Okay. Yes, please introduce yourself.
Okay, so my name is Franka Marlene Lauter. I'm in Professor Wolfer's class on Russian foreign policy. And my question goes to about misinformation in the internet. How can Russia, or how is Russia spreading false narratives within Russia, but also in other countries, for example, the US, and how's this flood of information increasing trust in the established classical journalism, and how can that be countered and kind of prevented?
So Russian misinformation and misinformation in general, right, is a giant challenge, and we've seen this, since the 2016 election or earlier. And Yevgeny Prigozhin, before his demise, had boasted of his election meddling. We know that there's Russian information operations throughout Europe. There have been, including unrest that is stirred by false reports of attacks on Russian immigrants in Germany, say. It's very hard for mainstream media to be directly responsive to that, because some of these stories don't rise to the level of coverage, outside of a region, but taken together, they can be very destabilizing. Obviously, the internet platforms have some responsibility there, but we've seen some of the big companies backing away from that role now, including in the U.S. So for our part, what I think we have to do is keep reporting the truth, keep being reliable, keep at what we do in a way that continues to build audience trust, so that if there's any doubt, they're looking to sources that they know they can rely on. Because we see stuff all the time that we're like this almost certainly isn't true, right? And you have to try to verify it. We're scouring all the various platforms, but it is pernicious, and it's only getting worse, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you hear me? My name is Ala Khan. I'm born and raised in Kyiv, Ukraine. I got a little lost between the connection of, on one hand, Russia invading Ukraine and committing war crimes there, and fight with anti-Semitism on college campuses. I lost what is the connection. There is real anti-Semitism on campuses right now, especially in Columbia and Harvard, spurred by pro-Hamas fascist demonstrators. So, but what is the connection with the war in Ukraine?
We're going to agree to disagree on that, because I've been living on the Harvard campus for this entire past year, and I don't see what you claim exists. So if you've spent time there and you've seen the anti-Semitism and you can describe it firsthand, I'd be very interested to see that. And not only have I been living there for the past academic year, since August, but my oldest son is a senior there. He's been there for 4 years, working on the Harvard Crimson and covering all these events that are happening. And the Harvard Crimson, with very fair-minded, brilliant students like the ones here at Dartmouth, has been hard-pressed to find genuine anti-Semitism directed at hatred at Jews. There have been a couple of incidents, mostly in response to President Garber's heavy-handed response to the protests. But what you have, and what I described, and then we can bring in the connections, is a conflating which has been going on for many, many years between views that are anti-Israel, and folks can have a right to be pro-Israel, anti-Israel, or Israel agnostic, and anti-Semitism. To be against what the Israeli military is doing in Gaza is not, by definition, anti-Semitic. Bill Buckley Jr., who's thanked in, or was in my day, thanked in every issue of the Dartmouth Review, tried to make a strong argument that that's actually the case, that one cannot be anti-Israel and not at one and the same time anti-Semitic. And as a Jewish person sitting here, I will tell you that's false. One can, in fact, disagree with the policies of Israel or the Israeli government and not have any animus or hatred toward the Jewish people. Two separate things. The talk was obviously about my experiences since Dartmouth. And the events that are happening now, the allegations of what I would say is highly exaggerated anti-Semitism, which is not in fact anti-Semitism, but is constitutionally protected speech on college campuses, where you would expect young people who are getting their higher education to learn how to exercise their constitutional rights, right? Conflating that with anti-Semitism is a mistake, and bringing out the riot police to the Dartmouth Green with the, again, I've seen this response in Russia, where wearing a press badge, I am now subject to attack by police and potential arrest while doing my job. Like, that's not the kind of thing you should see in a state whose motto is live free or die.
Russian torturing and killing Ukrainians, including babies and children, was fighting anti-Semitism.
I'm equating, as I said in the talk, I'm equating the Russian riot police response to pro-democracy demonstrators to the Hanover and West Lebanon police response to pro-democracy demonstrators, or anti-war demonstrators, as you would call them, here in Hanover on the college campus. And if we want to go into the discussion of the Ukraine war, part of what you have is a challenge about, as this talk was about journalism and understanding facts and information, the lies on which Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine is predicated. And the lies that now are being picked up by President Donald Trump and his negotiators repeating these assertions that, for example, the sham referendums that were held in parts of 5 territories of southeastern Ukraine somehow justify them as Russian territories and annexation. It's a complete lie. We've been there on the ground. We have reporters on the ground. We're talking to people. They're being forced to vote at gunpoint, if that. It's absurd. Or another one, which I should have maybe mentioned in the talk, but I figured we'd get to in the questions. You hear another talking point picked up now by the Trump administration that Zelensky is a dictator because there's been no presidential election in Ukraine since the full-scale invasion in 2022. And there was supposed to be, by the regular calendar, a presidential election. But guess what? Under martial law, because there is a war going on, because millions of people are displaced from their homes, because hundreds of thousands of soldiers are away from where they should normally be if they were going to vote, because missiles are falling out of the sky constantly, it is absolutely impossible to organize an election that would meet international democratic standards. So holding an election would be the anti-democratic thing to do. But Putin is making this case that, Zelensky is a dictator because there's been no election, when in fact you cannot hold the election. On the contrary, the elections that have taken place repeatedly in Russia, where candidates have no access to media or are denied from running, as Navalny was, those are sham elections each time. But those appear, again, to distant viewers, and you're talking about this problem when looking from afar. It seems like there's elections in Russia. Except they're not elections, right? They're coronations. And what's happening in Ukraine is a protecting of democracy unless and until peaceable conditions allow for a real election to move forward. So don't put words in my mouth. I'm not equating those two things. There are parallels of events that have happened in different places.
Okay, further questions? In the back.
Good evening, my name is Rolando. I'm a professor in linguistics and computer science. Thank you so much for the presentation. And we just said coronation, so no Russian Tsar lives forever. And at some point, we will have to deal with the post-Putin Russia. And you mentioned very briefly at the beginning of your presentation, the militarization of education. I've become very scared when I read about things like Unarmia, for example, like the youth army of Putin, and how all these military themes are being inserted into education. What effect do you think these are actually having in Russian society? What do you think the future of Russian youth and society is going to be in general after Putin?
It's a really good question. And again, I urge all of you to read this series that we did in the Washington Post called Russia Remastered, where you can read about all of this in detail. As journalists, often, one thing we aspire to is to listen to what people say and then watch what they do, right? Whatever Putin is saying, or his folks, including in discussions with the Trump administration, what he has done is build a society that is geared for long-term civilizational conflict with the West. And these are not ideas that will be dispelled very easily. It will take generations, according to Russian experts themselves. So it's an alarming situation. Right now, there are, and we hear this in our reporting, Putin is hearing some skepticism and concern from his security services because of how quickly Trump seems to have pivoted to a Russian point of view. They sense a trap. They don't trust the United States. And so there's an underlying baseline level of distrust that may stand in the way of even any meeting of minds between the Trump administration, which is as friendly to Moscow as we've seen in a long time, and the Putin administration, just because, again, there's this history of betrayals, or that's the way that it's been perceived. So it's a really good point that when you have told people over and over again, this is your enemy, that Russian soldiers are dying because of American weapons in Ukraine, that folks will believe that, and generations of folks will believe that.
Well, I'm afraid we have come to the end of this session, but I have to thank you, David, for a rich and beautifully structured and appropriate and timely set of remarks to which we were very, very lucky to be able to react. So thank you very much.
Thanks for your great questions.